Hey, everybody, and welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Chef AJ, and my guest this evening is Joe Keon. He has been a wellness consultant for more than 25 years and holds fitness expert certifications by both the Cooper Institute for Aerobics Research in Dallas, Texas, and the American Council on Exercise. Joe is a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and a past chairman of the board of directors for Dr. Helen Caldicott's Nuclear Policy Research Institute and past member of the Marin Health Council, a public health advisory to the Marin County Board of Supervisors. And his writings have been featured in numerous magazines and newspapers internationally. He has appeared on local and national broadcasts, including Martha Stewart Radio, CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, and ABC News. Joe is the author of Whitewash, The Disturbing Truth About Cow's Milk and Your Health, Whole Health, The Guide to Wellness of Body and Mind, and The Truth About Breast Cancer, a 7-step prevention plan. Whitewash has been proclaimed a silver medalist in the 2011 Independent Publishers Book Awards, the IPPY, and won Veg News Magazine's Book of the Year in 2011. Same year my book came out, I didn't win nothing. Joe's forthcoming book is a comprehensive lifestyle plan to slash the risk for Alzheimer's disease, and he's currently completing production on a feature-length documentary about Whitewash. That's going to be great. I can't wait to see that. And this is my first time meeting you, so it's so nice to meet you. And thank you so much for coming on Healthy Living, Joe.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be with you.
I have been wanting to meet you for so long. My friend Linda Middlesworth just says you are just awesome, and I bet you are, because your book was awesome. That's a great book. So what got you, first of all, what got you interested in this to write such an amazing book that won Book of the Year? It is a fabulous book.
Thank you. Well, really two things influenced my desire to write Whitewash, going all the way back to my childhood. I suffered from a severe allergy to milk.
Me too.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, well, and I still do, sure.
Way back then, for me it manifested as eczema. I had severe eczema on the backs of my legs, the insides of my arms. But my mother took me to a pediatrician who said, well, yeah, he's got a milk allergy, but, he'll grow out of it, was the first thing he said. And the second was, if you remove milk from his diet, he's not going to thrive. So let me prescribe this topical ointment you can put on the eczema, and it'll make it go away. And I would lay awake at night, scratching the backs of my legs literally until they bled. And eventually it did evolve into something else. But that really left an impression with me. And the second was later when I wrote The Truth About Breast Cancer. I was doing research and really looking at the common element of the role of estrogen. And that's when I first began to see about the presence of hormones, and particularly estrogen, in milk and dairy products. And so I kind of fell deep into the subject at that point, starting with the hormones and looking at allergy, and then the whole enchilada.
It's amazing how many people are allergic to cow's milk. I mean, it seems like everybody I know.
It's so far more prevalent, I think, than we're led to believe. And I think one of the problems is many physicians really aren't trained to recognize food allergy, and so they're not as observant about the kinds of symptoms that might be related to foods that are troubling people.
Yeah, so the whole book is about milk. If there were a single message that one should take away from the research you cite in Whitewash, what would you say it is?
Well, other than taste, there's not a single valid reason why anyone should be drinking the milk of another species. And
exactly.
Could you
expound on that? Because I understand it. I mean, to me, it makes common sense. But why do people think that we need the lactation fluid of another species? We're not historically milk drinkers, right?
Well, we've been told this for over 70 years. We've basically been told if we can just pack enough milk and cheese and yogurt into our diet, we're going to have robust fracture-resistant bones. But Americans are among the top dairy consumers worldwide, and we have terrible outcomes as a result. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 3 women will suffer a bone fracture in their lifetime. 12 million Americans have osteoporosis, and another 34 million are at risk of developing it because they have something called osteopenia, which is a low bone density. So we've heard this message. I'm fond of saying this is one of the most brilliant advertising campaigns in history because it goes against all common sense that we would be convinced that we need the milk of another species to support any nutritional need that we have.
Right. But do you know when it started? Because our ancestors couldn't have historically been milk drinkers. So one day did some guy just go up to a cow and say, "This is a," I mean, that's how it started.
So given, one must wonder. I mean, given the degree to which milk, the rate at which it causes a calf to grow into a, very heavy animal, somebody must have looked at that and said, "Wow, that might help me." But no one knows for certain. We think probably the first milk consumption was somewhere around 10,000 years ago. But milk drinking has evolved a great deal in terms of what we're drinking, what's in the milk, and how that milk can affect our health over the years. There was a researcher at Harvard some years ago in the 80s who was doing a lot of research on calcium needs, human calcium needs. His name was Dr. Mark Hegstead. And he said something late in his career that really resonated with me. He said, "It'll be embarrassing enough if the current calcium hype proves useless, but it will be immeasurably worse if it proves detrimental to health." And so in Whitewash, I showed with the research that basically it's well established that milk drinking doesn't protect us from bone fracture. So we transcend that hype. But now from a public health standpoint, I feel like we've got an obligation to look at what kinds of health concerns are there from following that erroneous advice. And people need to be making informed choices about, products that may influence their health negatively.
Do you think there's any chance at some point in the future we could do a class action lawsuit against the milk industry for telling all these lies? I mean, they really are, like you say, they have the best advertising campaign in the world. It's a triumph of marketing over science is what it is. And just like the tobacco industry, I mean, they're causing more deaths indirectly, I think, than almost any other product.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because the gentleman who was involved in the class action tobacco lawsuit years ago was actually contacted just a few years ago, it was 2.5 years ago, regarding a little disgust because there were agreements signed not to go public with this, but it was a dairy insider arrangement, which basically was called the Dairy Retirement Program, the herd retirement program, where they paid dairy farmers to agree not to farm dairy cows anymore and to turn over their cattle, which were subsequently killed. And the whole thing was actually designed by a young PhD student who basically did the math and said, if you create this artificial shortage, that you're going to be able to boost the cost of milk over X number of years. And the ultimate outcome was billions of dollars in windfall profits. And somebody got into the website with all this information and put together a class action lawsuit. And the very attorney who led the campaign with the tobacco industry took the case. They tried to have it dismissed, and the judge upheld it, and it was going to go forward. And there was an out-of-court settlement. And I had the opportunity to speak with two legal experts who were involved and had firsthand knowledge of this case, one of which was interviewed for my documentary film. So there have been a number of interesting cases around claims as well. The FTC has sued the dairy industry for some of the various claims that have been made over the years, which we can talk a little about later on.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, but I've got to know about this film because so you produced it yourself, you wrote it. When's it coming out, and where can we see it?
Well, right now I'm probably next week going to launch a Kickstarter campaign just to get the completion funding for all the post-production that has to be done on it. But
well, please send it to me, and I'll send it out because this is a really important film, and this is one that everybody's going to need and want to support. And hopefully maybe you'll have a perk where we actually get the movie if we give a little.
Oh, absolutely. There'll definitely be perks, and there'll be some fun, advanced screenings and products and things like that made available to people who become involved and support it. But it's been a 2.5-year venture. Pretty much anybody and everybody who is a luminary in the world of healthful nutrition is in the
nice,
film, including Walter Willett out at Harvard University, and many others whom you'd know. And it is. I think it's going to raise a lot of brows for sure.
Well, I cannot wait. That is just so exciting. So what do you say to people? Because, we don't need the milk of any other species other than our own mother. So what about now people are like, well, what about raw milk, or what about goat's milk? These are healthy.
Well, I always come back to the same point, which is we have no reason to be drinking the milk of any other species. There's about 5,400 different mammalian species on this planet that we know of that produce milk for their offspring, but in every single case, that milk is nutritionally unique. So the amount of protein, fat, carbohydrate, minerals is all different, and there's a recipe that's species specific. So when we start introducing these formulas into our bodies, we invite all sorts of problems that can manifest in a variety of different ways, not the least of which is the tendency to react negatively to the proteins, where we develop allergy, or we have issues with the milk sugar, lactose.
Yeah.
And so, again, if we don't need this, if there's no evidence whatsoever that supports the claim that we're going to have magnificently strong fracture-resistant bones, then we got to come back and say, what are we doing? What is this odd behavior that we're doing here? And in some instances, we're talking about, if nothing else, the contaminants that concentrate in milk, in all milk. In human breast milk, we know there are over 200 different man-made chemicals that are now sadly identified in milk samples, and it turns out the same way with cow's milk, goat's milk, and so you've got that issue. And when you talk about raw milk, and I know there's a real strong interest in this these days, but I can't tell you how many times a month, I get these reports from different feeds that I subscribe to of one person, here or there, or groups of people who are being infected with seriously dangerous bacteria from raw milk, and they're being hospitalized, and in some cases people die. Depending on their health when they're exposed, these can be very serious infections. So, that's an issue in itself that really needs to be looked at closely.
Well, you mentioned lactose, and it's so interesting to me that so many people say that they're lactose intolerant. So instead of just avoiding lactose, they'll take a pill so that they can still consume. I mean, that to me is absolutely crazy. That if you're allergic to something, you're taking basically like a supplement or a medication so that you now can consume the thing you're allergic to. That makes no sense to me either.
And that really was fostered by the dairy industry. They came up with lactate and reduced lactose formula and this and that. And don't worry about it. Says the advertiser, you can still consume milk and dairy products. Don't worry about the fact that you don't have the enzyme to break down the sugar in there, which should be telling you something again right there. This isn't intended for you.
Exactly. Isn't most of the world lactose intolerant anyway? I mean, I read something that I think it was something like 70% of the world, if you're Jewish, Latino, African American, Asian, Pacific Islander, isn't something like that 70% people can't even digest the sugar in milk as it is? It
is true. One of the highest levels of lactose intolerance is among Asians, with about 90% lactose intolerance. African Americans about 75%, and about 50% in Mexican Americans. So, collectively, yes, this is very prevalent, and it's normal. That's the thing is, I think some people characterize this as something unusual and there's a problem, but in fact, our body stops producing the lactase enzyme once we're weaned from the breast. There's no reason to make it. So this is a normal thing. So for someone to continue to produce the enzyme is really is not the norm. It's the exception, and it's just that people don't necessarily make the connection between the symptoms they're experiencing and what they've consumed.
Right. And they all seem to get well when they stop.
Right.
Amazing. So we covered raw milk. What about goat's milk? Because I hear people say, "Oh, but goat's milk, goat's milk is healthy because it's not, it's not factory farmed and it's from this nice little goat." And
Yeah, and it's that same thing where you see a concentration of environmental contaminants. Some people certainly who are reactive to certain proteins in one species milk may have an easier time digesting another milk. They may say, well, I'm not symptomatic, I'm not experiencing abdominal cramping or this or that or whatever it may be that's manifesting. But again, I just bring people back to that question of what are you doing in the first place? We meet all of our nutritional needs by eating whole, unrefined foods, and we have a much better absorption rate. If we're just talking about calcium alone, our absorption rate is up in the 50s and 60%, 40, 50, 60% area when you look at broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, turnip greens. But animal milk, we're talking about we absorb about 32% of the calcium in a glass of cow's milk. So we're getting something that's more helpful. It's free of cholesterol. It's free of the saturated fat. It's free of the hormones that are going to be in all mammalian milk.
Sure.
And we don't need any of that. We don't need to be messing with a delicate balance of hormones in our body.
Right. Now, I'm guessing you probably read the China study, right?
I did.
And so what Dr. Campbell discovered was that casein, which happens to be the protein in dairy, it was like the most potent carcinogen, one of the most he'd ever discovered. And so how does that really play a role? I mean, can you make people understand that that's really, aside from the fact about what you just said about the hormones and the environmental contaminants and that we don't need it, do you think that will help people understand just how detrimental it really is to be consuming dairy products as a human?
Amazingly, I find that it does not seem
wow.
to. We basically, cow's milk is about 80% casein. Human milk is about 40%. We're getting double the amount of casein when we consume that milk, and that was startling research. Unfortunately, outside of the book itself, it doesn't seem to have gotten much attention. But in the end, I look at all of this as really coming back to something, just the concept of informed consent. I think all of us have different buttons, that get pushed eventually. One way or another, we get inspired to make changes in our lifestyle that are going to be more helpful for us. But some of these issues about the nutrients and the science and stuff don't seem to inspire people, and I don't know why. Sometimes it's about somebody close to them becoming ill, and then starting to look at the connection between choices they've made. Sometimes they're inspired by animal welfare issues. Environmental issues increasingly are starting to become something where it's interesting. I'll hear people say, I'm more concerned about the animal's welfare than I'm concerned about myself, or I'm concerned about the environmental issue. But there's so many different ways of looking at it. There's so many things here. We can talk about the environmental impact of dairy farming, especially the large scale, the CAFO farms, and their enormous impact on environment, on greenhouse gas release, on water consumption, so much.
Yeah. So all this stuff that you've said about milk, which I agree with, and how it's so detrimental, why do people like it? I don't even think it tastes good, honestly.
It does taste odd. And I think part of this stems from, this is the thing that we have been told from the very first years of our life, how important it is that we have to consume this. We turn to our parents who we trust. They're telling us this is what you've got to do. You've got to drink this glass of milk. You've got to eat this cheese and yogurt and such, and this is going to make you grow up and be healthy and strong. And the articles, there are just countless articles every month that come out, particularly in women's health magazines and such. They keep reinforcing this myth that if we don't drink the milk of a cow, our bones are going to crumble and we're going to have other health problems. And I think it's really difficult because you look at even the registered dietitians and physicians, pediatricians, people who are involved in formulating public health policies, they are just as mired in this mythology, and it is just as challenging for them to step back and look at this with some common sense, if not look at the body of scientific evidence that is so conflictual with what we've been told for the last 7.5 decades.
Right.
So I think that's one of those things, where it's so ingrained, and we have in the back of our minds this fear that, wow, could I be doing something wrong here? Am I putting myself at risk for bone fracture or something else if I forego milk and dairy products. The other side of it is, you've got a brilliant marketing campaign. You've got the USDA, federal government, is telling us you've got to do this, and the school teachers telling us you've got to consume this. And pretty much everywhere we turn, we're getting this message that this is the right thing to do, and this is the helpful thing for us to do.
It's just this gets me so mad because I've been vegan for almost 40 years, and I guess if people want to eat animals, it's not against the law, they can, and I don't really get it, but I just don't get the milk thing. It is just nonsensical to me.
It is. It's I don't know. I remember seeing this ad where they had this gorgeous woman wearing a dress and high heels, kind of squatting and actually like suckling the udder of a cow, and that's exactly what I think of. It's like you would never do that, Right. Exactly. When would that have occurred to you? Right. It is. It's just it's a masterful campaign, and we all have heard this message so long, and I think even in the absence of good taste or any other feature, we keep turning these glasses of milk or putting more cheese on what we're eating under the false belief that it's health food.
Right. Well, it's funny because I can often work with people and get them off dairy, at least liquid milk, and because there's so many milk alternatives now. When I went vegan in 1977, there was no alternatives to milk. There wasn't even powdered soy milk yet. And now you can go into any store anywhere in the United States, even Mexico, and even the 99-cent store in Walmart, and they have soy milk and rice milk and almond milk and flax milk and quinoa milk and coconut milk and hemp milk and oat milk and hazelnut milk and cashew milk. You name it, right?
Yeah,
and these taste delicious, and they're inexpensive, and you don't even have to buy them in a box. You can make them yourselves. You throw some hemp seeds in with water or some almonds in, and so I can usually get people to stop drinking the liquid milk. But then it comes down to, but I could never give up cheese, and I remember I interviewed Howard Lyman on Healthy Living, and he said, when he gave up cheese, he said it was harder than quitting smoking. So can you talk a little bit about the why? Because I know Dr. Barnard talks about the casomorphines and how that creates these opiate-like chemicals in your brain, and they're more concentrated in the cheese, yogurt, and ice cream, and that the real reason people like these isn't because it's cow pus or, cow lactation secretions. It's because of the chemicals that are created when you consume these.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been some research that's identified these as you said, the casomorphines, these opiate-like compounds when the proteins are broken down that may be taken up by opiate receptors in the brain, just like a drug that we would be given in a hospital after surgery and recovery, and that there may be, it makes perfect sense, of course, if you have young offspring, and nature, of course, wants that offspring to survive, and if you have some substance in there that creates sort of an addiction or a desire to come back and suckle, it makes perfect sense, and they have been identified. They're very low levels, but of course, as you said, when you make cheese, you take out a lot of the water, you concentrate the protein and the fat, and it may be that that's why people have this affinity for cheese. I, am just blown away by how many people have told me that over the years. They'll say, I'll give this up, I'll give that, but I will, and the way they say it's just they're adamant, I will never give up my cheese.
Well, then it has to be addictive because, again, maybe I'm skewed because I'm allergic, but I always thought it was disgusting. And before my dairy allergy was identified, I remember where other people were asking for extra cheese on their pizza. I was like pulling it off so that I could eat it. Because it's just so disgusting to me. And the thing is now, if you like the taste, if you're really eating it for the taste, we've got, Miyoko Shinner's cheese all available in her book. You can make it. But see, I don't think people eat, I don't want to say expertise, but maybe a little bit. My passion is now in helping people with food addiction. And I don't believe that anybody eats anything for taste. I think you eat it because it makes you feel good. End of story.
Yes. I agree with you.
And that's what cheese does to your brain. And you're right. It just seems so hard. And what gets me, Joe, is there are people, and I know these people because, like you said, a lot of people, maybe even most people, become vegan for ethical reasons or vegetarian. And yet if you consume, there's no way you can be an ethical vegan or vegetarian if we can't be a vegan. You can't be if you're consuming dairy products, because I think dairy cows have probably the worst plight of just about any farmed animal. Maybe chickens are just as bad now. Well, actually, it's all bad with pigs, but that's a bad life for those cows, you know?
Oh, it is a miserable life. And I just a couple of months ago went down in the Central Valley in California and saw firsthand. I went down with a camera crew and we interviewed a number of people, and we went on some of these properties where they have 10, 15,000 dairy cows crowded into these confined areas, and it is really one of the most disturbing things I have ever witnessed in my life. And the way that these cattle are raised, whether they are they're dehorned, their tails are cut off. They are given feed that is engineered, to make them grow very rapidly and to produce high levels of milk. They are given, in some cases, hormones. They are given recombinant bovine growth hormone, and which, of course, creates mastitis, which is an infection of the udder, and then they must be treated with antibiotics. And then you may get some of the antibiotic in the milk, and it's truly just one of the saddest situations that we've created. One of these dairy cows in a natural setting might live to be 25 years of age, but these cows have been artificially inseminated so many times and given this high-octane feed, and such demands have been placed on them. Most of them are exhausted and unable to produce after just 3 years, at which point they're sent off to the slaughterhouse to make cheap hamburger.
Oh my God, that is just so sad to me. And their young is taken from them. I mean, if you drink milk, aren't you supporting another industry that's deplorable, the veal industry? Because if cows didn't have babies, there couldn't be veal.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There's no value to a male cow, so the males are taken away and they're put in veal crates and restricted from any movement. And that certainly the dairy industry is part of that. Supporting the veal industry as well.
Are you going to show some of it? I mean, I hate these graphic images, even thinking about it, but is this going to be shown in your film so that people can understand the ramifications of consuming dairy?
It's a really important question, and I have to tell you that I produced a trailer, and I sat down with a test audience, a small test audience of people I know, and I had footage because when people got wind of the fact that I was making this film, I got contacted by a number of animal advocacy organizations who were, somewhere at the time, were actually in the middle of undercover investigations. And I ended up having really, really disturbing footage shared with me. And I cut some of that in initially. But what I found was people became so uncomfortable with this footage that they wanted to leave the room. They wanted to get up and leave the room.
Sure. And you need them to see the film, so.
And what I witnessed was they seemed to be incapable of taking in the really important information. That is important, but the rest of the public health information and transcending the mythology and everything was really lost. And so I've been really reevaluating this, trying to look at ways to use some of the footage in a way that's not going to be making people so uncomfortable and offending people, but still giving them an understanding, because it is something that is cloaked, if you will, and most people can't even imagine, what's going on back there. We see these commercials about so-called happy cows out in wonderful green pastures and such, and it's nothing like that.
Right. It's like that old saying, if slaughterhouses had windows, everyone would be vegetarian.
Right.
If people, maybe what you could do is, I don't know if I don't really like scary movies, but as part of this thing I was doing, I had to see this very, very scary movie called The Ring, and they had these extras that supposedly were even scarier. Maybe that could be the extras, so that the people can be warned that graphic footage is coming up, and then they could choose to either watch it or not watch it.
That's actually a good idea. It could be additional footage that's available on a website or something like that later on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks
Well, I
suggestion.
hope the movie will premiere in LA, and I'll do anything I can to get the word out and help you in any way, because that's going to be very, very, very exciting. So I appreciate you doing that. I spoke up in Tillamook in Oregon, and what they do up there is they make cheese. That's what they're for. And it's funny because so many of the employees there actually were having lifestyle diseases like heart disease as a consequence of eating their product, and and they were kind of secretly taking the CHIP program, the Complete Health Improvement Program, because this was their livelihood, which I thought was real interesting.
That's amazing.
Yeah. It's crazy. So if milk and dairy products are so problematic, why is it that our U.S. government promotes them so heavily in the public health policy and the dietary guidelines? Are they being paid off? Because this just doesn't seem right.
It's a really strange situation. If you look at the USDA has kind of a dual mandate. They set and then revise dietary guidelines for Americans periodically, and one would hope that these guidelines are based upon the latest nutritional science and are in the best interest of the public. But here's where things get tricky. The USDA was originally set up by Abraham Lincoln, and this was really set up as an advocacy organization for American farmers. Their job, the USDA's job, was to promote American agriculture, and then this role of setting nutritional guidelines came upon them, and so it's kind of odd. How can the USDA ever tell Americans to eat less of a food that their constituents produce?
Yeah.
So I'll give you a concrete example of this, because this is actually in the film. The USDA's split personality is illustrated here really well. A couple of years ago, the USDA issued a public health document, and they had this on the website, and it was disseminated in various ways. And basically, it was strategies for improving health, lowering your saturated fat intake, because we know that saturated fat is associated with elevated risk of heart disease, stroke, hypertension, and actually Alzheimer's disease as well. It's a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And so in the sheet they said to consumers, ask for half the cheese on the pizza you order next time. But at the same time, the USDA was entering into a partnership with Domino's Pizza to create and promote a pizza which they named the Wisconsin. Now this pizza has 6 cheeses inside of it and another 2 on top. Half that pizza exceeds the USDA's suggested daily intake for saturated fat for the day. So this was a formal agreement entered into between the USDA and Domino's for one reason: to promote American dairy products, to sell more product. And you can find these documents online, but this is this problem where it's difficult to really not look at these guidelines with suspicion because of the degree to which the USDA is, influenced by the industry that it's promoting, the industries. And so that is one of these issues, because when you set up these dietary guidelines, then those become dictates in public school systems, in the military, and everybody's following these. Registered dietitians are using them as guidelines for their clients. And so, again, we're getting the message that this is something we should be doing, we should be consuming a lot of, and it's health food.
It's so sad. There's some adults that I've talked to that they'll concede that dairy doesn't seem to be the right thing for them to consume, but they feel adamant that kids, especially, young kids, growing kids, they need milk, they need cheese to grow healthfully. How do we respond to this?
I've had that experience. It is so interesting where an adult is willing to part with the dairy, but they'll continue to feed it to their children. And that, again, it's a deeply seated myth in our culture that says that children will not grow up healthfully, just like my pediatrician said to my mother, he's not going to thrive if he's not giving cow's milk. Parents, teachers, dietitians, pediatricians alike, they've all been persuaded to believe this. And common sense should just tell us, of course, that our children no more need the milk of a cow than they do the milk of an elephant. And in fact, children who don't drink milk, who aren't introduced to cow's milk, they thrive. They're less likely to succumb to allergy, intestinal blood loss, which is an issue in young children that are given milk early in life, recurrent ear infections, constipation, even type 1 diabetes. The risk is higher for children who are exposed to milk early in life. Weight problems, even behavioral problems have been tied to cow's milk consumption in children. And more recently, there's been some very good studies published, which I like to direct people's attention to, because again, you come back and you say, well, why are you doing this? Well, we're worried about, we want to make sure that our children develop strong bones and they grow up healthily. Well, Pediatrics, the journal Pediatrics published a study that seriously challenged this idea that cow's milk was required for strong bones in children. It was a meta-analysis where they look at previously published studies and put them all together, because sometimes you can discern certain things that don't show up in the individual studies. And this was an analysis of 58 previously published studies. And the clear majority of these studies found there was no relationship between dairy consumption or dietary calcium and intake and measures of bone health, is basically what they said. And this kind of study, there have been 3 or 4 major studies like this that have come out in the last several years that really show us that we don't need to succumb to the pressure, to the myth here, and children can do just fine. If I tell parents, if you're really concerned about it, you can choose one of these non-dairy beverages, find one that they like the taste of, and they're all fortified with calcium, and in some instances D and B12, and that should give you some peace of mind, so you don't have to worry. But I know it's difficult. I know of a woman who had been vegan for years, and then she became pregnant. And early in her pregnancy, she was advised by her physician that you need to start eating cheese and drinking milk and this and that. You're building a whole new skeleton. And she went into free fall, and she panicked. And she thought, oh no, I'm doing something wrong here, and it's going to hurt my baby. And she was terrified. And she really had to be talked off the ledge. And I was kind of bore witness to this, to come back and look at this with a reasonable mind and not succumb to the kind of pressure and the conventional wisdom that women hear all the time.
Do people not realize that doctors get almost no nutritional training in medical school?
Oh, it's just, it is so deficient. And it's so unfortunate because, as you know, the conditions that they're being faced with in their patients are largely nutritionally driven. And they are, in most cases, not well prepared to give good advice on how to address these conditions. They're really trained to write prescriptions and treat symptoms.
Yep. Oh, brother. So you know what you hear, and I'm sure you hear it too. Well, where am I going to get my calcium? Just like if we don't eat meat, where am I going to get my protein? Yeah.
Well, the best place to get calcium is plants. And
that's right. Leafy greens. They have more calcium anyway, and more utilizable calcium, right?
Exactly. And beyond that, we have this preoccupation with calcium. We talk about calcium so much. We talk about bone health, and then it's just calcium. But what we forget is that in the absence of so many other nutrients, I'm talking about magnesium, manganese, potassium, boron, B12, D, C, B6. There's so many. It's a symphony of minerals, of nutrients that must be present in order to form healthy bone matrix. So when you look at the biggest creatures on this planet, elephants and cows and horses and gorillas, where do they get their calcium? They don't get it from drinking somebody else's milk. They get it from plants, and they do wonderfully well, and we will too. And the wonderful thing is that when we get our calcium from these sources, we omit the hormones, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, and the long list of contaminants that we know that concentrate in cow's milk and other animal milk.
Right. Is it true, Joe, because I've read this, but, not everything you read is necessarily true, that something like 80% of the world's antibiotics go to cows, go to livestock in general?
It's absolutely the lion's share. It's certainly in the U.S., the large majority of all antibiotics end up on factory farms and are given to the animals. And it's not just, one would assume this is a preventive measure to try and keep them from becoming ill, but it actually is about growth too. We don't even know why, but when they give these animals this kind of drip feed of antibiotics, they grow much more rapidly, so they get more bang for the buck. They grow up sooner and they become productive in terms of making milk, or if they're beef cattle, they reach a weight for slaughter sooner. So it is one of the scariest situations right now, which I feel like is not getting nearly enough attention, but we're losing the battle with regard to antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
And that's from eating animals, eating cows that have taken all these drugs, right?
And it's the bacteria that just proliferate and develop resistance to the drugs, and they spread from one person to another, to an animal, it's so easy for this bacteria to proliferate and get spread around, and we're feeding dairy and beef cattle and pigs and other animals the very drugs that we need to save lives in American hospitals. And a number of these drugs have come up in the last couple of years as useless. They do absolutely nothing, and people are literally dying in hospitals in this country today from conditions that only a few years ago could be treated effectively with first-line antibiotics.
Right.
And pretty much anybody who has looked at this comes back to it and says this is about the wholesale abuse of these drugs in animal agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So the hormones they're giving these dairy cows, it's to get them to produce something like, I heard, 40 times more milk than they could ever produce in nature. And also they're kept pregnant while they're nursing, which doesn't also occur in nature, right?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that's fairly unusual in dairy farming. In the U.S., we milk cows right through late-stage pregnancy. And the reason that this is significant is as a pregnancy advances in a dairy cow, she starts to produce higher and higher levels of hormones, and those hormones are given off in the milk. So as an example, if you take milk from a cow that's not pregnant, and then you compare that to a glass of milk taken from a cow who's in late-stage pregnancy, there'll be about 33 times as much estrogen in the pregnant cow's milk. And this is significant because we know, for instance, that about 85% of all the breast cancer we see today is hormone-mediated. It's driven by estrogen. And we're getting about 80% of the exogenous estrogen or estrogen from outside our body from milk and dairy products. So that's a really important source that we need to be looking at. The other one, of course, is the cattle are given, many of them are given recombinant bovine growth hormone, the genetically engineered hormone, which causes them to produce, as you said, so much more milk than they would in a natural setting. And the reason that that drug does that is it boosts something called IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1.
Right.
And this is a very hot topic in the world of oncology. People who are studying cancer and looking at cancer risk have come to see that those who have the highest levels of IGF-1 in their body have a dramatically elevated risk of breast, colon, and prostate cancer.
Right. So yeah.
So yeah, we ask, how are we elevating this? Well, we have these cows which we are injecting with RBGH. It boosts their IGF-1. That IGF-1 is chemically the same as ours, so it ends up expressed in the milk. We consume the milk. Now our IGF-1 levels go up. And then the next thing we're doing is we've been for decades breeding the dairy herds to favor the ones that just naturally produce more IGF-1, because dairy farmers found that a high IGF-1 producer makes more milk for the same amount of feed. So if we can populate our whole herd with high IGF-1 producers, we're going to do more. We're going to do better profit-wise. But from a public health standpoint, this is really problematic because we're getting exposed to more IGF-1. And we can, if you want, we can look at that in terms of breast and prostate cancer risk, because there's very good studies about that.
Well, it's true the people that, or countries or people that consume the highest rate of dairy have the greatest rate of osteoporosis and hip fracture, right?
Absolutely.
So is it not also true that we could apply these statistics to these reproductive cancers like breast cancer and prostate cancer?
You do see that. You see a lot. You see it more like you see some like the USDA's published some graphs on total fat intake, saturated fat intake, and breast cancer incidence worldwide. But the IGF-1 is pretty compelling. So let's say prostate cancer, there's 22 or 23 studies now showing a really strong correlation between milk drinking and the risk of developing prostate cancer. 1 in 7 men in America will develop prostate cancer in their lifetime now. And so they looked at it and they said, is it the fat? Well, they found that the risk was just as high in men who were drinking low-fat milk. So they turned their attention to IGF-1. And they basically have shown that the risk of developing prostate cancer is 4 to 8 times higher in men who have the highest IGF-1 levels compared to those who have the lowest. And it gets really high up there after age 65. And in women, we see the same thing. The women with the highest levels of IGF-1 have a 3 to 7 times elevated risk of developing breast cancer compared to those who maintain the lowest levels of IGF-1. And the reason is that IGF-1 is just a bad actor, as we call it. It's mitogenic, which means it promotes cell division, and unregulated cell division is a central theme in cancer. It's needed for tumor growth, and it promotes metastasis. That's where a cancer is no longer just relegated to one tumor, but it has spread and colonized other organs in the body. And that's the kind of cancer that kills. That's the cancer that's really hard to eradicate.
I mean, it's startling that if anyone knew these facts and statistics, they would even, it's not even like it tastes good. I could see like if it was, I don't know, a hot fudge sundae or something maybe, but why? I shouldn't say that because there's real ice cream, it's milk, but it just does not make sense to me. So, little girls are getting their periods earlier than ever in human history, which means they're getting pregnant earlier. And my understanding is if you lived in in natural environment, you'd reach menarche at like anywhere, 17, maybe even 19. Does the fact that they're consuming milk that's been laden with these hormones from pretty much, a very young age is what's causing this to happen to little girls? Develop breast buds and things like that?
I think it makes sense. When you look at it, again, this is the primary source of hormones. There are about 60 different hormones and growth factors in a typical glass of milk, and that's whether that milk was produced organically or conventionally. It's going to be there either way, and that makes sense. We do know that there have been cases around the world where beef that was treated with the cattle were treated with estrogen implants, and cases where they kind of went a little overboard. And you found outbreaks of very young girls developing what they call precocious puberty, signs of entering puberty, but I'm talking in like 6 and 7-year-olds.
Yeah.
And these were isolated cases that were linked back to these products that they were consuming. So I think it makes perfect sense when you look at something that is such a potent source of hormones, and puberty, of course, is instigated to an elevation in hormones, that this could be happening. We know that areas in the world where people still eat a traditional diet that's naturally low in fat. They're not being exposed to these hormones and such. Girls may begin to menstruate at 15, 16, 17, and now we're talking in the U.S., the average age is 11.5.
Wow, that is very disturbing.
Yeah.
So is there such a thing as hormone-free milk? Because I've seen that advertised. It seems like even if they didn't add the hormones, the cow's milk would have its own hormones.
Exactly. It's really misleading. I've seen those labels as well where it says, this is a hormone-free product, no hormones added. All milk, organically produced or not, contains, as I say, somewhere around 50 to 60 different hormones. So we're talking about pituitary hormones, thyroid hormones, steroid hormones. They're there to help grow a calf as rapidly as possible.
Exactly.
But we don't want to be upsetting our hormone economy in our body, and especially, as you mentioned earlier, these hormone-driven cancers, the prostate cancer, the ovarian cancer, the breast cancer, that are on the rise. We want to be looking at anything that may be influencing hormone levels in our body.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that the cows often get mastitis, for which they're treated with antibiotics, I think even prophylactically. And anybody out there that's had a baby that's gotten that knows how painful it is. But when you have mastitis, your nipples or udders, in the case of the cow, they crack and they bleed. And so then they exude pus. So isn't this pus going in the milk, and our government allows this to be in the milk?
It's true that we have, in the U.S., we have one of the highest tolerance levels for pus in milk, and it is really disturbing. Somebody said to me, "It's not a milk mustache; it's a pus stash."
That's great.
And yes, if you have cows that are sick, they're going to be giving off this pus in the milk, and as I say, we have a high tolerance level for it. It's not very attractive, is it?
Yeah. Well, what I don't get is because, like I said, I was at Tillamook. I drove by the farm. I've been drawn through I've driven past that Central California place, and that the stench was just overwhelming. So I've never really seen how dairy cows are treated or milked. But I'm assuming that they don't take them for a walk, like I take my dog Bailey for a walk every day. So they're just kind of standing in one place, it seems, their whole life. So when they urinate and defecate, where's that going? Is that going in the milk too? They
are. You're absolutely right, and I saw this firsthand. They are standing in their waste, and it's staggering. I mean, some of these facilities have had to acquire adjacent land to just pile up the mountains of waste that are produced by these cows, and it is something else to see these literally mountains of waste that are there. But when I looked at these cows, literally they had it caked on their sides. They'll lie down in it, and then they get taken in to be milked, and of course they do put disinfectants on the udders. They do everything they can to try and minimize the risk of contamination, but we know it is happening. We know that this bacteria is getting into the food chain, and we have regular cases reporting the E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter and all sorts of things that are ending up in there. So it is definitely not the most sanitized set of circumstances I've ever seen. Yeah, so in addition to the pus, which our government allows, I don't know how many parts per million, there's blood and poop and pee in the milk. Right. Right. That would be enough. I just can't imagine if people knew that they would still want to drink it. And I hope you show some of that in your film, because I think that would be just a really startling visual for people to understand. It is. It's a real turnoff. And you can go even further in, because when you look at milk, as I was saying earlier, it's a sink for toxins, and it's because a lot of these environmental toxins are what we call lipophilic. They bind with fat. So if we're talking about like dioxin, which is an endocrine disruptor, it is a carcinogen. It messes with thyroid hormone production. Dioxin is prevalent in all dairy products. Pesticides, herbicides, PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, flame retardants, dry cleaning solvents, antibiotics, even radioactive isotopes from the nuclear power industry have been detected in milk. And So you've got this plethora of contaminants in here, and some of these factors like the pesticides, just those alone, we know some of these they're formulated to attack the nervous system of living creatures. So we don't want those kinds of things in our body. We certainly don't want them in our children's bodies. But when you look at this whole laundry list, it's a soup of toxins beyond the saturated fat, beyond the cholesterol, which we don't need. So there's a long list of constituents that we really don't want to have coming into our body, but unfortunately are just so prevalent that if you're consuming the products, you're inevitably going to be exposed to them.
Yep. Oh boy. Well, I just don't know what to say. This drives me crazy. So they're adding the vitamin D to the milk, right? Milk doesn't have vitamin D.
Right. It's fortified. Yeah. And there have been some interesting surveys over the years. I mean, it's all over the map. It can be very, very high, or it can be below what it actually says on the carton. It's not always what it says, but it is added.
You know, it's like you said, I think the dairy industry has hired some of the best PR and marketing people, and their campaigns like milk does a body good. Isn't that the one that PCRM actually made stop? Like they sued them because saying that really wasn't true?
Yeah, when you look at these campaigns all the way back to 1970, I mean, they seem to have problems with every single one of them.
Because they're lying, basically.
Yeah. I mean, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, sued the dairy industry back in, I think it was 1970, and that was at the time that they were suggesting that milk could actually prevent colds and arthritis. That was the claim that was made back then, and the FTC said, it's unfair, false, misleading, and deceptive advertising. In 1974, again, they were sued. And then, of course, PCRM was involved in another one of them. The campaign, you remember the one about the weight loss, milk as a weight loss aid. That was a $200 million campaign, but their bluff was called. There was a public publication that looked at 41 randomized clinical trials, including a Harvard Medical School study, that demonstrated it did nothing of the sort. So they abandoned that, and then they jumped on it was the colon cancer prevention, and then I don't know if you saw it because this one was so short-lived. It was the PMS reliever. It was called the Everything I Do Is Wrong campaign, and it was supposed to be sympathizing with guys and saying that if women just drank enough milk, they wouldn't have PMS. Yeah. And I wrote a piece on this. And collaborated a bit with New York Times bestselling author and gynecologist Dr. Christiane Northrup. And I thought she'd be a wonderful resource to talk about this. And she said, it's basically the opposite effect. Here, milk is a stew of hormones, and menstruation is a hormone-driven event. PMS symptoms are believed to be, basically a result of estrogen dominance over progesterone, and adding more female hormones, in the form of estrogen, is just going to magnify this imbalance. And that campaign, it had no scientific research to support it, so they abandoned that. And now it's the My Life campaign, I think, where it's promoting protein of all things, which of course we have no protein deficiency in this country.
I know.
So they eventually, the truth comes out about all of them. And the reality is the dairy industry is in a bit of free fall. I mean, they really have lost they've had a per capita drop since the early 70s, about 36%. That's an enormous shift in market share, and they're losing that ground to the non-dairy beverages, which have exploded, as you know.
And they're delicious, and they come in chocolate and all kinds of flavors, and they're yummy, and
Right, and they're almond milk and soy milk and coconut milk and hazelnut milk. All these things have really captured the attention of Americans, and so they're scrambling, they're hurting, and they're trying to do everything they can to convince consumers that this is a product that's going to solve some problem you may have, or maybe in fear having at some point.
Yeah. Well, good, because I mean they need to have their day, in court, because they've been producing this carcinogenic product that's hurting animals, hurting the environment, and hurting human health for so long now, that somebody's got to stop them, and I nominate you. So
Thank you.
you're welcome. So Joe, I don't know how come we never met. I'm everywhere. How can people find you? Do you speak? What do you do? And do you have a website if people want to know more about your film and your book?
Yeah, the website is whitewashthebook.com.
Okay.
And I can be contacted off that site. There's some information about the book and just some of the general issues that are discussed in there, and then I'll post information on there regarding the Kickstarter campaign once that's up and running. And there's a Facebook page. It's Whitewash on Facebook, and I post there pretty frequently. There's some interesting article links on there, and there'll be information there too when the Kickstarter campaign's up, and when the film is going to be out, and where, what kind of events we'll be doing to promote it and get people involved. So
I can't wait. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. One last question I just like to ask all my guests, and it doesn't have to be anybody in the plant-based world. Who inspires you to do what you do? Because in your book you say for you SS, and I'm wondering if it's SS.
Oh, you know who inspired me very much? Colin Campbell has been a great inspiration in recent years. Somebody who was around a while back was Mark Hegstead, and he really was a terrific guy. He worked at the USDA Center for Human Nutrition and was really a leading thinker way before his time. And I think, I quoted him in the beginning about, the current calcium hype, and he really saw it for what it was, but so many years ago. And I think he was really an elegant man and a wonderful researcher and very well regarded in the scientific community. So good inspiration.
Well, great. Thank you. And thanks so much. It was just a pleasure getting to know you and talking to you. And it went so quickly, as it always does when there's an interesting guest. And I really look forward to your film. And so everybody, please go to get the book Whitewash if you haven't read it. And when the film comes out, let's all support it, because this is a really, really important film.
Thanks so much, Chef AJ.
And thank you for being on Healthy Living. And thanks all of you for listening. I'm Chef AJ, and I make healthy taste delicious. Good night, everyone.